It's been a while since we've spoken about the Stoics, and we've mostly spoken about the familiar Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus on this show. They have left us with most of the works that we still consult today, 1700 years later, as the core ideas of Roman Stoic philosophy. But one Stoic teacher who somehow remains slightly less known is Musonius Rufus. And why it's a little odd that he's a little bit less known is because he was really the teacher of Epictetus, who is considered the kind of the core source of much of Marcus Aurelius's teachings and of Roman Stoicism, other than Seneca. Seneca is a little bit of an exception. He's a little bit different than where the rest come from. To put it quite simply, Epictetus was a freed slave, whereas Seneca was a wealthy senator. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. So sometimes criticized because of that. Nevertheless, his writings remain very influential. But somehow we don't often see or acknowledge the important contribution of Musonius. And in fact, as I've said, he is really the root of much of which follows. So he is certainly worth a visit, especially since in many of his ideas, he takes a particularly modern approach, what we would consider a modern approach nowadays. He's very much more practical. And in fact, that is much of what his ideas are about. It's really how to be a practical Stoic, or how to employ philosophy practically in your life, about which he had much to say. So in coming episodes, we will visit Musonius now and then to see more of what his teachings are. What I want to do this evening is introduce some of his ideas, perhaps compared a little bit with the more regular ideas of Stoicism on those topics. And then in times to come, we'll have a closer look at his teachings. One of the most emphatic things that Musonius talks about is that philosophy is a practice, not just a bunch of theoretical ideas. He said virtue is not a theoretical knowledge, it is a practical knowledge. And he compared it with doctors or musicians, where he said, you know, you could study medicine as much as you like. You can study music as much as you like from books and from teachers and so on. But unless you actually practice them again and again, you're never going to be able to do it. You could read all the medical textbooks in the world and go to all the medical lectures and know absolutely everything about medicine and the human body. But unless you continuously practice medicine, you won't be able to do it at all. And of course, music is also a great example of that. You could study music endlessly, but we all know that actually being able to play music means a lot of actual physical training. So Musonius says, the man who wants to be good must not only learn the lessons which pertain to virtue, but train himself to follow them eagerly and rigorously. Virtue, remember, is why we study philosophy. We want to learn how to be virtuous. And virtuous doesn't only mean being good. It means doing the right thing, living your life in the best way possible for yourself and for your society. Musonius in particular laid a lot of emphasis on how our own behavior and virtues are a very important component of how we kind of plug in to the rest of society, which is, of course, exactly the point of virtue and philosophy. Philosophy is about knowing how to be virtuous, how to be the best possible human being that you can. So he says, could someone acquire instant self-control by merely knowing that he must not be conquered by pleasures, but without training to resist them? Could someone become just by learning that he must love moderation, but without practicing the avoidance of excess? Could we acquire courage by realizing that things which seem terrible to most people are not to be feared, but without practicing being fearless towards them? Could we become wise by recognizing what things are truly good and what things are bad, but without having been trained to look down on those things? which seem to be good. Therefore, practicing each virtue must also always follow learning the lessons appropriate to it, or it's pointless to learn about it. The person who claims to be studying philosophy, he says, must practice this even more diligently than the person who aspires to the art of medicine or some similar skill, inasmuch as philosophy is more important and harder to grasp than any other pursuit. Which is an interesting thought. And of course, he's referring to the fact that ultimately, if you're learning a skill, be it music or medicine, it's a bunch of a whole lot of practices connected to a theory that once you learn those practices, essentially, you can do it. And the more often you practice them, the better you can do it. But philosophy is, of course, more abstract, and it involves applying a whole bunch of practices which are variable and changing, often according to the circumstances that you're in or a variety of other factors. Philosophy is harder to grasp because it's not based on do this, do this, do this, do this. It's often based on be this. How do I be this? But what is very important is that he talks about practicing it. You cannot just read about something. So we can all read the great masters, and they tell us about self-control, and they tell us about detachment. But they also tell us you've got to meditate vigorously. You've got to eat in a certain way. You've got to get up early in the morning. You've got to do all these tasks, which often seem so odious. And people say, you know, why can't I just be the virtuous kind of person, the detached person, all of these kind of things, without having to meditate for hours in the morning? It seems such a difficult discipline. And that is exactly Musonius's point. But his point is also about practice. He says, of course, that if you're practicing it, you'll get better and better at it. And that is, of course, the key about practicing everything. When you see it that way, it becomes obvious, whether we're talking about self-control, courage, moderation, wise, all of those things that Musonius has mentioned in that passage. They all seem desirable, easy to understand, but difficult to acquire. And how do we acquire? How do I acquire wisdom? Well, the simple answer, as Musonius says, is practice. Doesn't mean it's easily acquired as a simple answer, but it's practice. And practice is something that is accessible to everyone. So Musonius says, philosophy is not a bunch of ideas. It is an application of those ideas. Traditionally, in Stoicism, the virtues that Musonius refers to are wisdom, self-control, courage, and justice. Justice often a little bit misunderstood because it's, of course, it's like a legal term. So people think he's referring to that. And it's more like he's referring to fairness and equanimity. And maybe a better word for that, often suggested, is love. And that doesn't mean romantic love, more about Musonius' thoughts on that a little bit later on in the other Stoics, but really just about treating everyone with kindness and fairness. And that is really one of the aims of philosophy. Courage is an important one. And courage, something perhaps very well understood by many of the philosophers in Rome and other thinkers who were often exiled as a form of punishment. Not only that, I mean, if you take Seneca, for example, Seneca was forced to commit suicide, like great philosophers before him, Socrates. But at any rate, Musonius was sent into exile. And he wrote about exile. He said, essentially, in discussing the idea of how bad is exile, and this is, of course, where courage comes in, how bad is it to be exiled? He asks the question, which is worse, vice or exile? Which is a worse thing to be plagued by? Terrible bad habits, vices, or being sent into exile and cut off from everything and everyone, which is a worse thing? And he says, well, the courageous man is as courageous in exile as he was at home. Therefore, he always says, as boldly what he thinks when exiled as when he was not an exile. So the question becomes, well, how does exile affect who you are? And he says, let me tell you how I convinced myself not to be bothered by exile. As I showed you in that statement, I do not think that exile completely deprives a person of the things which many people consider good. And even if it would describe a person of those things, it does not deprive him of things that are truly good. Meaning, he goes on, a person in exile is not prevented from having courage, justice, self-control, wisdom, or any other virtue just because he is in exile. When these qualities are present, they tend to honor and benefit a person and show him to be deserving of praise and fame. The absence of these qualities works to harm and shame him by showing him to be bad and without fame. Fame doesn't mean famousness, it just means acceptance and appreciation by the world. Consequently, if you are a good and virtuous person, he says, exile would not harm or diminish you because you still have the things that can best assist you and elevate you. But if you happen to be a bad person, it is vice, not exile, that harms you. Vice, not exile, brings you grief. You must work on freeing yourself from vice rather than from exile. Well, maybe we need to adjust those words a little bit just to understand more deeply what he's trying to say, because some of us are thinking, well, exile isn't a real threat to me. And some of us also might thinking, well, vice is a bit of a strong word for a few bad habits or something like that. But of course, what he is telling us is that we can take ourselves wherever we go. So whether you're in exile or you're temporarily somewhere else, or maybe we can put it in the modern context and say, you have to spend, at least 8 hours of your day in an office in a place where you wouldn't be living or you wouldn't want to be. So maybe all of us are a little bit in exile every single day. And we could ask the question, which is worse, having bad habits, but being at home, or having to go to work every day? And he's saying, well, you take your bad habits to work every day. You take everything along with you. If you have courage and wisdom and virtue and the various virtues, then that you take those wherever you are. And you can be your best self, your virtuous self, wherever you are. So therefore, vice is worse than exile, because exile does not prevent you from being virtuous, whereas vice does. Remember Musonius' student, the extremely famous Epictetus, teacher of Marcus Aurelius and also one of the roots of Roman Stoicism, reminds us of the first principle of Stoicism this way, where he says, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can clearly say to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own. That is a very powerful thought when put that way. When he says, exile is a form of evil done on someone. A bad habit, a vice, is a form of evil done on yourself. Since the first rule of Stoicism reminds us that we cannot control anything that's outside of our own purvey. We should not give our attention and our energy to things that are outside of our control. Therefore, exile becomes something we shouldn't be worrying about. If you're in exile, you have to accept it because that's not under your control. But your own vices, your own evils are under your control. It's a little bit like that well-known serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's the core principle of Stoicism. We cannot change what happened to us in the past. We cannot change the result of that in the past, the choices we made in the past, the hurts we've suffered, the hurts we've caused, but we can change the future by having the power of choice and control over the choices we make right now. That is ultimately the power that he refers to. So he says, exile, you can't control that, but vice, you can, because it's you and it's your body. On the subject of self-control, Musonius was quite big on the idea of eating the right foods. Now, he's not the first of the ancient teachers to do that. Of course, there were many before him, going all the way back to Pythagoras, who advocated vegetarianism and probably was influenced by the Indians in that, but not necessarily. And also there were many such ideas throughout the ancient world. As we know, we see them in religions and philosophies which advocated eating one kind of food or another. But for Musonius, what was really important about food was that it's the beginning of and the basis for self-control. Certainly, as we know, the Romans had very healthy appetites, and many of the kind of archetypal images of indulgent Rome involves large feasts and people consuming massive amounts of food. So that was the basis for his advice on how to choose food. He said, firstly, one should choose inexpensive food over expensive food, and food that is easy to obtain rather than food that is hard to obtain. And most importantly, we should choose food that is suitable for a human being over food that isn't. And while that sounds rather strange, think about it for a moment. The special foods we get, the foods that come from other countries that we don't think for a second, especially nowadays, they certainly did. This honey has arrived from the land of wherever. These kind of precious delicacies, going right up to the end of the 19th century around the world and into the 20th century, where it was not taken for granted that you could have certain fruits in certain countries and certain times of the year and so on. And a lot of energy and money and effort was put into acquiring foods from just about anywhere. And food becomes very expensive. But he says, why are you eating it? Is this about just satisfying your taste buds? And while there is not something inherently wrong in that, it does mean you are subject to your appetites. And as soon as you are subject to your appetites, you're not in a state of self-control. So, and remember, he requires practice. Then you can say, oh, I don't have to have the caviar, I'll really be fine without it. And while that is true, but he says, okay, live your life without it. Practice is what makes you virtuous. So on the subject of food that is suitable for a human being over food that isn't, he says that a meat-based diet is too crude for humans and more suitable for wild beasts. It is too heavy and it impedes mental activity. It's very important to understand that a person 2,000 years ago could understand that and say that, because it obviously was one of those well-known things. It's like, a lot of people today think that the knowledge that tobacco is dangerous and causes disease and death comes from about 1961, when the Surgeon General declared so. But of course, King James was complaining at the end of the 16th century that his subjects are all dying because of tobacco that had come from the Americas. So it was always well known. So other forces, whether they be economics or desires or fashions, drive a lot of what we eat. So Musonius says, choose food not for pleasure, but for nourishment, not to please your palate, but to strengthen your body. The throat was created as a passageway for food, not as an organ for pleasure. Plants, he says, take nourishment for the sake of their survival rather than for pleasure. And for humans as well, food is the medicine of life. That's what he called it. Therefore, the goal of our eating should be staying alive rather than having pleasure. at least if we wish to follow the sound advice of Socrates, who said that many men live to eat, but that he ate to live. No right-thinking person, says Musonius, will want to follow the masses and live to eat as they do in constant pursuit of gastronomic pleasures. Again, it sounds harmless, and it's not the food that's the harmful part, although he does say that as well, but it's the lack of self-control and the being driven by your appetites rather than by your choices. So food is the department of self-control. And since plants and other animals eat to live, the bonus for self-control is that we will obviously live much more healthily if we eat what we are supposed to eat in order to live. There's lots of information packed into that that sounds so appropriate to the modern mind, but hearing it there for thousands of years reminds us we always knew that. How did we get ourselves into the situation where we eat so much rubbish and then create so much disease with that? If only we listen to the wisdom of our elders, a topic that we often talk about on this show. Finally, Musonius makes some comments on love that are a little bit different from what many of the other Stoics usually talk about, although not out of alignment. He's just focusing on something else. So he says, shouldn't everyone do things for his neighbor as well as for himself, and thus make sure that his city has thriving families and that it is not a wasteland? Isn't this how commonwealths thrive? A virtuous person displays love for his fellow human beings, as well as goodness, justice, kindness, and concern for his neighbor. Given all of this, he says, shouldn't each person, out of concern for his city, create a family with the well-being of the city in mind? So in talking about love, Musonius is very focused on the idea that not so much personal love, but that love is a function of us in society. That by creating loving families and loving relationships, we contribute to a loving society where people respect each other, respect their neighbors, and love their neighbors. The idea of love thy neighbor is not new to anyone, it's not new to any particular culture or philosophy, but it's focused on by Musonius because he says that's really how we achieve a commonwealth, a better world, and we achieve our own virtue by caring for others. So he takes that fourth virtue, justice, love, and interprets it as love and fairness and equanimity and kindness, something ever more important in the world today. So if sometimes that idea of Musonius might seem a little, well, idealistic, or maybe you don't even agree with it, that's what the priority should be. Remember the word kindness, and perhaps Musonius is really trying to remind us, ultimately, if we create loving relationships with in our own families, we will naturally respond with kindness to those people around us. Epictetus, who he taught, really focused more on what personal love is all about. But he did say, whoever then understands what is good can also know how to love. But he who cannot distinguish good from bad, and things which are neither good nor bad from good and bad, can he possess the power of loving? To love, then, is only in the power of the wise. There's an interesting leading thought by Epictetus. To love is only in the power of the wise, because in order to love, you have to be able to distinguish good from evil from neither. And as his teacher Musonius tells us, you have to understand the context of love in order to have a better society. A very interesting thought. As I've said, the Stoics do tend to talk more about personal love and its consequences, and how we can achieve loving without breaking down the ideas of Stoic self-control. Stoicism is not about pursed lips not loving anything, but certainly Stoic self-control must find a way in order to express love. Happiness in Stoicism is a life lived without passion, desire, pain, grief, or fear. How does love fit into that? Love is often related to high principles in Stoicism. But where does that leave romantic love, personal love, friendship love, family love? So next time when we talk about Stoicism, we'll talk about the Stoics on love. But in the meanwhile, I'll see you here again next week at the same time.